Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Russell Eassom, and I'm here today to talk to you about the strength of players faced and kind of like the impact that has on war. Today I'm going to quickly do an introduction, then I'm going to go through a metric that I've created, effectively strength of players faced, and then how that impacts war, a little then discussion over the kind of like how historically that has impacted over the few previous years, some variance, and then we'll evaluate it and do some further development. So I came about kind of like looking into this sort of thing because the disparity that we've seen in like the most recent seasons of baseball is larger than has been seen in a very long time. In my personal viewing of baseball over the last 15 years, we had 700 win teams in the last two seasons, 700 loss wins in the last two seasons. And I wanted to know, does that disparity translate down to the player level? And if it does, should actually we be including that information in the standard WAR calculations? Because with the exception of Baseball Reference's pitcher calculations, their batting calculations do not take into account any strength of players faced. So I originally created this metric and blogged about it in 2018 when I was investigating the performance of the Cleveland Indians. I am an Indians fan, and when we had two top 5 hitters and 4 of the top 10 pitchers by F-WAR and got blew out by the Astros in 3 games, it was like, what on earth has gone on here? A lot of people were saying that they faced weaker opponents, which made them look better during the regular season, and I actually wanted to find out if that was the truth or not. So to do that, I created this metric, strength of players faced. So it's calculated by taking the average end of season WOBA of the players which a hitter or a pitcher has faced. So for example, if a batter had 10 plate appearances against a pitcher with 300 WOBA and 10 against a 330, then their strength of player faced would be 315. And so logically, for batters, the higher the strength of player faced, the easier the pitchers that they've actually played against during that season, and for pitchers, the lower, the easier hitters that they've faced. So the values you can see now are what I had in 2018. So I took all of the pitchers and batters that had faced, I think, over 100 plate appearances or 100 in total batters faced, and I removed out facing pitchers from AL and NL just so we could actually compare. And as you can see, on the left-hand side, Perez, Greg Allen, Jason Kipnis, like you've got a lot of, and Michael Brantley, Indians players, Trevor Bauer, Mike Clevenger on the other side. So my initial piece was just kind of like ended here. I was just kind of, it gave me like and what I wrote about was just saying that, yeah, they kind of definitely faced easier opposition in getting to that position, and maybe that had something to do with why they weren't actually so good in the postseason. But I revisited this again this offseason, because once again we had a huge number of 100-win loss and win teams, but we also had 2 very tight MVP races if you were using F-WAR. So Mike Trout and Alex Bregman were separated by just 0.1 of a WAR, and Christian Yelich and Cody Bellinger were tied by F-WAR. So I wanted to see if it was valid to try and separate them based on who they faced. I think, as an individual, it's fairly logical to kind of say, if you face Garrett Cole more times than you faced Dan Straley, that you're going to have like a much harder job of doing what you do, and if you got the same amount of home runs against Garrett Cole that you got against Dan Straley, there should be more credit going one way than there is the other. The real next question is like, how much difference do we actually expect? And then if it was actually large enough, is it a meaningful enough difference to a player's WAR value to actually consider making a change to the systems? From here onwards, I concentrated on you doing F-WAR and hitters because that's where the values were closest that I wanted to investigate. So to create my strength of player-based WAR, I amended the weighted runs above average calculation that is part of Fangraph's F-WAR. So at the top, you can see the current calculation for the weighted runs above average. Effectively, a player's WOBA is effectively compared against the league WOBA and then divided by the scale and times by the number of plate appearances to give how much they did above average. Now, my idea was the strength of players faced actually is like the average that you should expect for that individual. So I replaced the league WOBA valuation with my strength of players faced, and that would give you a new weighted runs above average. And then to change that so we could see the difference in WAR, you've just got the equation down at the bottom, which is just what would happen if you remove the two columns together and then divided by the runs per win calculation for that year. Just to note, didn't have to do any factors for any cut park factors or anything like that, because that is a linear factor that's already taken account of later into this calculation, so we didn't have to worry about that. So this might be a little bit small for some of you to see, but for 2019, once again, Indians players, Astros players had the easiest, basically as batters had the easiest time. The Rockies had one hell of a hard time in 2019, who they faced. So you can see that on the top. And then from the bottom, we've got the WAR change. So the players, Carlos Santana, Francisco Lindor, Roberto Perez, Oscar Mercado, they all would lose about 0.4 WAR if we were to use my new calculation. And on the other side, you'd have Nolan Arenado, Charlie Blackmon, Starlin Castro, all gaining 0.4 or 0.5 of a WAR if we made this change. Just for reference, obviously the WOBA League reference was 3.2 for the year. So we go back to the MVP race. If you look at that here, the strength of the players that they all faced, with the exception of Christian Yelich, they all faced slightly below average players for across that season. So most of them, the WAR change would be negative, but there is a difference between them. So this now goes to say that Mike Trout has 8.5, Alex Bregman had 8.1, Yelich 7.9, and Bellinger 7.6. Now these differences aren't still large enough to kind of definitively say that Mike Trout was better than Alex Bregman last year and that Cody Bellinger was worse than Christian Yelich. But it just paints a slightly different picture to what we had before. So armed with doing that for the last couple of seasons, I wanted to go back in time to see how much this would have affected players historically. I had a slight issue because pitching WOBA is not something that is really stored on most of the major sites and easily gettable. But I did find it on the Fangraph splits board. So basically, we have data from 2002 onwards. So all of the data presented about historical is from 2002 onwards. So I redid all of the calculations then for 2002 onwards. And there you've got the top 10, and in both regards of the people who had the easiest hitters, or the hitters who had the easiest job, and the ones who had the hardest job. So you can see, once again, as before, the 2018 Indians are up there, but also the 2002 Red Sox are up there as having a very easy job, so their WAR calculations would have been brought down. And then it's the NL West teams, specifically over the last two seasons, are up there on the right-hand side, as well as some of the Padres from 2009. One thing I wanted to note is that I then looked at who were the two spectrum of best and worst affected per year, and the greatest difference basically between the best and the worst players was 1.1 WAR, and that was in 2018, whereas back in 2005, the difference between the big players who'd have the biggest changes was only 0.6, so effectively you were going one would have minus 0.3 and the other one would have plus 0.3. So the difference is a lot greater in the last season than it has been historically. So this is basically from 2002 onwards. This is then their cumulative change to WAR. So as we were seeing before, we were having players getting 0.5 plus or minus, and we've got 18 years worth here. There isn't anybody who has effectively constantly faced a below average team for their entire career. There's nobody who's gaining 9 WAR or losing 9 WAR, because we all understand that baseball is cyclical. There'll be times where teams and leagues and divisions will change. But what we are seeing, especially on the negative side, once again, is quite a lot of the recent Cleveland Indians players: Carlos Santana, Kipnis, Lindor, Ramirez, Austin Jackson, Michael Brantley. These are all players where they've only got 4 or 5 seasons at the Indians or even in their career, and they're already losing this percentage or this value of WAR if we were to make this change. So I then took the more holistic approach to look at the whole team level, because we then, once again, unsurprisingly, it's the Cleveland Indians in 2018. By my calculations, their offense would be overrated by 5 wins, basically, in that season compared to the standard method, which would have dropped them from the 5th best to the 14th best. And I think that then paints a interesting picture which could understand maybe why they actually failed so significantly and spectacularly against the Astros. And in the reverse, you have this 2018 San Francisco Giants, who were 4.5 wins better than would have been given credit for by the current method. Now, that doesn't really take them anywhere kind of that great from 28th to 25th, but it gives you some idea that kind of they had 7 WAR projected for like the entire season. I'm like increasing that by like nearly 60% just off making this one change. So I saw a lot in all of these calculations that I made that 2018 kept on coming up, 2019 kept on coming up as the years that had the biggest difference. So I wanted to see, had something changed in the last few seasons that we hadn't seen previously over the other years, so why we're kind of like getting so much. So I decided to look at the variance of pitching at a plate appearance level to start off with. So what we have here is take all 700,000 pitches that you have each season, you assign the WOBA value for that pitcher for their season, and perform effectively like the standard deviation calculation. And you can see over the last few years, the standard deviation of pitching has increased. So we are seeing basically a wider spectrum of pitchers getting game time. And I think to most of us here, that would make sense. We've seen a lot more players come up and go down very quickly in some of the teams, like some of the teams who aren't doing well have rotated through a large number of minor league players who are getting a very small amount of game time. So I wanted to then see, this is obviously a plate appearance level. I wanted to see if we saw the same at the level for strength of players faced. So we see the same, that there's a high increase for 2018 and 2019, but we don't see it for the 2 previous years, and we also see a really high increase back in 2002 as well. So those 3 seasons, there was actually a higher variance in what batters faced. So these are seasons where you're kind of getting a great difference for some players. Now, I plotted those 2 against each other to see if we had some correlation. It's 0.242. It's not anything kind of like amazing to write home about, but there is definitely something here. So having that wider plate appearance level variance is definitely making it more likely that we will have a greater variance at the strength of player level for individuals. I just wanted to quickly also show you kind of like the distribution over like the past few seasons. So up here we've got like anybody who had 200 plate appearances, what their strength of player face was. The red line is basically the average WOBA for the season. You can see pretty much on most of them the distribution, the mean kind of like comes down right at like the mode. Sometimes there's peaks either side of it, but it has like that. 2019 has quite a different distribution to any of the other seasons that I have there. The mode is below, and there's quite a big tail kind of going up, so that kind of like some players who actually had a large amount of time faced a much easier thing. Now, this is just one season here. I don't know if this is a trend that's going to continue kind of going forward, but it definitely shows that kind of something is happening differently over the most recent seasons. I just want to quickly also show you kind of like the variance or like the standard deviation of a batting WOBA over a plate appearance level. Now, that information is much easier to get. We can go back all the way through kind of like baseball history to get most of that information. And you can see down in the bottom right as well, in that case, we're seeing a rise over the last few years that kind of after we've been seeing a general decline over like the previous few seasons. So in the end, I basically want to evaluate the new WAR that I created. Now, to me, there's a very simple adage for creating a new WAR is you have to compare the complexity that you've added to the calculation to the win redistribution that it has created. Like I say, public-facing metrics have a struggle with adoption if people don't understand them. You have to be able to easily explain what you've done so that people will go like, oh, I get that, I understand. We are in a position with sabermetrics where there are some fantastic metrics that are out there that aren't used by the general public because it is too complicated to kind of explain to them, but they are very good. So a complex stat will struggle with adoption. So just for example, we've added in, or not, Fangraphs have added in the framer catching over for the last few seasons. It uses generalized additive models, it uses logistic mixed effects. This is actually really quite a complicated model, and it is significantly more complicated than any other part of the Fangraphs war calculation. But it was included because of the difference that it made to the war. The redistribution of wins within catchers and other players meant that it was worthwhile putting that in, even though it does add complexity, which may make it harder to get the general point across to individuals. So let's come back to my SOP war. So the seasonal win distribution, it is minimal, but it has been increasing over the last few seasons. So for 2018 and 2019, there was 64 out of your 100 wins, or out of your 1,000 wins were redistributed using this method, whereas over the previous 16 seasons, it was averaging just 51. And career-wise, the players that I showed you before that had the higher and the lower changes, their values for their career was changed by about plus or minus 8% on average. But as I said before, the teams did cyclical. There was only actually 52 players across that entire window who had their win value changed by more than one win. So personally, this is a small change, but I don't believe it is a significant change to the overall calculation. So I think it's something which should be considered for any upcoming changes or to be monitored to see if this actual variance level continues over the next few years. So we'll just go through some further development of what I thought. Is pitching WOBA a good enough actually reflection of true talent? So I've used this because it was a very simple way of amending war in the end, because we could easily make a change and replacement in the calculation that was going on there. Right now, we may need to think about regressing to the mean for some of the pitches for small sample sizes, because currently it was a very simple calculation. So if one pitcher had one plate appearance and it was a home run, the person who hit that home run gets no credit because you're expected to get a home run off that guy. Or if they only struck people out and you don't get anything against you because we expect everybody to get struck out by that individual. There are two caveats to that, though, that if we start to include regression in how we're calculating this, it makes the calculation more complex, so the value of adding it into the new method becomes less. Or we could simply use something like the league WOBA if a pitcher hasn't faced a minimum number of batters. That would keep the calculation simple again, but kind of remove those issues. I also wanted to look how we could do this for amending pitching war, but I didn't get around to time to doing that. So finally, I just want to thank and acknowledge Fangraphs, Baseball Reference, RetroSheet, everybody out there, Baseball Savant, StatCast, Chadwick Borough Baseball, all the people who basically give all that data and it's out publicly available. Without any of that, none of the work that I've ever done would be possible. The online sabermetric community is a fantastic place where people will just give you free advice if you just ask them, so it's great. I put especially Tom Tango up there. The number of times as an individual out on Twitter I've just gone, Tom, can you look at this? And he'll go, yes. I think that's the reason why, to me, he's being given an award later on in this conference. I think that's fantastic. And then just the rest of the people who I write with in the UK who kind of run Vaps and Nerds. I'd just like to thank them all. So, any questions?
I don't need this, but have you applied this to any particular player?